What happens when a fearless young White House press secretary confronts a legendary talk show host on his own stage and flips the script entirely? This isn't just politics, it's personal, powerful, and unforgettable. If you're someone who values truth, accountability, and the courage to speak without a script, then stay with us. Because this moment, it's the kind that doesn't just go viral, it echoes. The Skyline Theater pulsed with anticipation as the cameras rolled, casting a golden glow over its grand, modern interior. Tonight wasn't just another episode, it was a nationally televised town hall event titled Voices of a Divided Nation, promising a face-off that viewers across the country had been waiting for. The auditorium, recently restored and wired for primetime broadcasting, hummed with nervous energy. The audience was a carefully selected mix of students, military veterans, journalists, and civic leaders, diverse in appearance, but all unified by one thing: curiosity. At center stage stood two chairs facing each other beneath a subtle banner reading, "Conversation, not combat." Yet everyone knew combat was exactly what might unfold. As the opening music faded and applause roared to life, Julian Colbert stepped into the spotlight, exuding familiar charm and charisma. Known for decades as a master of satire, he carried the weight of the old guard, comfortable, commanding, and battle-tested, behind a mic. But across from him, seated with poise and unshakable calm, was Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, her silver cross subtly gleaming under the stage lights, she represented not only a rising conservative generation, but a challenge to the very media traditions Colbert embodied. She greeted the crowd with a nod, her expression unreadable. As the host welcomed everyone and laid out the evening's topic, media responsibility in modern politics, a slow murmur moved through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Social media hashtags were already trending. Yet in this moment, with Colbert's smile locked in place and Karoline's gaze quietly fixed on him, the mood was still contained, polite, performative. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. The audience could sense it. Behind the calm facade, the first sparks of confrontation were already flickering, waiting for the right word, the wrong joke, the one line that would turn conversation into confrontation, and elevate this from a televised debate into something unforgettable. The first few minutes unfolded like any typical Colbert segment, light, fast, disarming. With a grin that had diffused senators and Hollywood legends alike, Julian leaned forward and asked with a twinkle in his eye, "So, Karoline, are you here to defend Trump or just teach me how to make TikToks for Gen Z?" The audience erupted in laughter, the kind that filled theaters and living rooms alike. Karoline Leavitt, however, didn't flinch. Her smile was polite, tight, almost amused, but her eyes carried a glint that suggested the real game hadn't even started yet. "I'm here to speak the truth, Julian," she said coolly, her voice steady but sharp. "Something you might not be familiar with after 2 decades of turning everything serious into a punchline." The temperature in the room shifted. Laughter trailed off mid-breath. Murmurs replaced chuckles. Even Colbert's smile flickered for the briefest moment. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to strike so early, or so precisely. "Ouch," he said with practiced charm as if brushing off a paper cut. "Well, truth is subjective these days, isn't it? I tell jokes that expose the mess underneath. You deliver speeches that cover it up." Some claps returned from the crowd, his loyalists, but the dynamic had already changed. Karoline didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she leaned forward, arms crossed loosely in front of her. "Is that what you think this is, covering things up?" she asked, a coolness in her voice that contrasted sharply with the usual rhythm of Colbert's show. "I answer questions from the press corps every day. No laugh track, no writer's room, just me. But your whole brand is built on the idea that if you're laughing, you're thinking, and maybe that's true. But the world isn't laughing, Julian, it's hurting. And your jokes? Sometimes they make it worse." A hush fell. Colbert, to his credit, didn't retreat, but his tone changed, less glib, more measured. "So, you're saying I'm part of the problem?" he asked. Karoline tilted her head, her smile returning, this time with just a hint of steel. "I'm saying satire can be a shield for cowardice. And sometimes the cost of a good punchline is paid by someone who can't fight back. The audience, caught between admiration and discomfort, sat straighter in their seats. This wasn't just a political spat, it was the start of a deeper reckoning, and the gloves, it seemed, had just come off. Julian Colbert leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he studied Karoline Leavitt, the smile on his face beginning to feel more like armor than amusement. "You make it sound like comedy is the enemy," he said, tone still light but noticeably more careful. "I'm not out here to hurt people. I'm here to make them laugh, to think, sometimes even both at once." Karoline's expression didn't soften. In fact, it sharpened. "That's the problem, Julian," she replied. "You think laughter is neutral, but it's not. Not when it targets people who never signed up to be part of your punchlines." The theater, once filled with playful energy, now simmered in uneasy silence. Even the camera operators slowed, sensing that something more than banter was unfolding on stage. "You say you make people think," Karoline continued, her voice calm but rising in force. "But have you ever considered what you make them think about, or who you make them think less of?" Colbert opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance to respond. "You sit in this chair, night after night, poking fun at institutions, people, moments that matter deeply to millions of Americans, and you call it satire. But there's a fine line between exposing hypocrisy and becoming a part of it. Do you know how many people don't laugh? How many feel dismissed, dehumanized?" The audience sat frozen, no longer participants in a show but witnesses to something raw. Julian shifted, sensing the weight of her words. "Karoline, I mock those in power. That includes your boss, your party, anyone who claims to lead but fails to serve." But she didn't blink. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "You mock what you don't understand. You turn people into caricatures so they're easier to ridicule. And while you're laughing with your writers and clapping with your audience, real people are out there dealing with the consequences. You don't get the backlash, they do." Her tone cut through the theater like a scalpel. Clean, deliberate, and undeniable. Colbert's trademark composure faltered for a beat. He adjusted his cufflinks, his voice slower now. "So what, do you want me to stop joking, stop challenging power?" Karoline shook her head, eyes locked on him. "No. I want you to own it. Own the influence you have. Own the people who get swept up in your wake while you move on to the next segment, because when you mock someone on national TV, the world doesn't forget. Even if you do." The final sentence landed like a blow, not shouted but whispered with such precision that it echoed louder than any applause. The crowd didn't know how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded slowly. Colbert looked at Karoline and for the first time didn't respond with a joke. He simply nodded once, barely visible, as if acknowledging that beneath all the satire, maybe he had more to answer for than he ever allowed himself to believe. The first real blow had been struck, and it wasn't theatrical, it was personal, and it was just the beginning. The pause that followed was thick with anticipation. Everyone in the Skyline Theater could feel it. Karoline Leavitt sat still for a moment, as if choosing her next words with surgical precision. Then, in a voice steadier than ever, she said, "Let me tell you a story, Julian. Not about me. About someone you'll never see on this stage." Her tone shifted, not confrontational, but quietly loaded. "His name is Jake Ramirez. You don't know him, and that's exactly the point. He's not a celebrity. He didn't run for office. He didn't ask for a spotlight. He was one of the people behind the scenes during the campaign. Smart, hardworking, the kind of guy who carried coffee 1 hour and drafted strategy the next. A believer. Not in me, but in the mission." The room hushed even further as Colbert leaned in slightly, curious but guarded. Karoline continued, her words gaining weight. "He was the kind of person who made sure the microphones worked, who fixed the seating chart at 2 a.m., who stayed long after everyone else left because he believed that maybe, just maybe, politics could still mean something." Then her voice dropped. "And then, you made a joke." Julian blinked. "Me? You or your writers or someone on your team? It doesn't matter who pinned the line. What matters is the impact. You ran a segment mocking our campaign, clips taken out of context, quotes twisted for laughs, a bit about us being fanatics in blazers. People laughed. That night you got the applause. But someone filmed Jake backstage, added a mocking caption, cut it into your segment. The clip went viral within hours. The internet devoured him. Her voice remained calm, but there was heat underneath. Controlled, focused. He didn't even know until his sister called him crying. He was being called a fascist intern, a meme, a joke. Karoline paused, letting the horror of it hang in the air. He was asked to step down, not because he did anything wrong, but because the organization feared the attention. His reputation shattered overnight. No hearings, no due process, just one joke, one laugh. The audience sat frozen. Colbert was no longer smiling. "I had no idea," he said quietly, almost instinctively. Karoline nodded. "I believe you, but that's the problem. You didn't have to know. You didn't have to care. You moved on. Jake didn't. He spiraled. For a while he shut down completely. He said he felt like the world saw him as a clown, not a contributor, because you don't need millions of followers to be ruined online. You just need one clip, one caption, one night." She leaned forward, voice tightening. "And here's the part you didn't see. Months later, Jake came back, not because he forgave the world, because he still believed in what we were doing. He still showed up, quiet, unnoticed, and did the work. No press, no public platform, just heart. And today, he's one of the few people I trust without hesitation, not because he's the loudest, but because when everything fell apart, he still stood for something." Colbert exhaled slowly, visibly moved, but Karoline wasn't done. "That's who you made the butt of a joke, Julian. That's who your laughter crushed. For a moment, maybe forever. And he's not the only one. There are thousands like him, people who don't have PR teams or blue check marks to defend them, people your jokes hit like punches, because they can't punch back." Silence fell over the room like a velvet curtain. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Karoline's gaze didn't break. "I'm not asking you to stop being funny," she said finally. "I'm asking you to recognize that the line between commentary and cruelty is thinner than you think, and when you cross it, someone like Jake pays the price, not you." For a brief moment, Colbert looked smaller than he had at any point in his career, not humiliated, just sobered. And as the audience sat in stunned quiet, something irreversible had shifted. This wasn't satire versus politics anymore. It was humanity versus performance. And Karoline Leavitt had just put a human face to the cost of a laugh. For the first time in the evening, Julian Colbert didn't have a quip ready. His hands, usually animated with theatrical flair, now rested quietly on the desk in front of him. The gravity of Karoline's story lingered like smoke in the theater, and Colbert, ever the seasoned host, recognized the moment for what it was. A turning point. "Karoline," he began, voice lower, more measured, I didn't know about Jake, and I'm sorry. Truly. I never meant for anything like that to happen." His words hung there, not a performance, but an admission. The audience, too, was still, leaning forward, some wide-eyed, others arms crossed in silent judgment. This wasn't a space where jokes lived anymore. But Karoline didn't let up. "I'm not here for an apology, Julian," she replied. "I'm here to talk about the culture that makes stories like Jake's possible and allows people like you to never see the aftermath." She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Her calm was its own form of indictment. Colbert shifted again, brushing invisible lint from his blazer, an old habit when discomfort crept in. "Look," he said, struggling to reclaim footing. "I've been doing this show for over 2 decades. I've been sued, boycotted, threatened, for calling out politicians, CEOs, war criminals. I don't hide from consequences." Karoline leaned forward. "Yes, you've faced backlash, but it's not the same. You have a platform, a fan base, a protective bubble. Jake didn't. Most people don't." The words landed with precision. "You get to keep going even when you cross a line. Most people just disappear." The implication stung, and Colbert's response was slower now, no longer trying to win but to survive the round. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked, not as a host but as a man facing a mirror. "Silence? Censorship?" Karoline shook her head. "No, just awareness. Responsibility. You say satire exposes the truth, but sometimes it bulldozes it." "You're not a villain, Julian, but you're not off the hook either." Colbert nodded, the flicker of defensiveness giving way to something else. Reflection. The audience sat in the stillness, watching a man who made a career out of making others uncomfortable now sitting squarely in that seat himself. And though his voice remained quiet, the tremor was unmistakable. The ground had shifted, and for the first time, it wasn't under Karoline Leavitt, it was under him. The air in the Skyline Theater had grown heavier, more electric. Karoline Leavitt sat still, her composure intact, her eyes focused, not just on Colbert but on the crowd now watching with silent reverence. Julian Colbert, though momentarily disarmed, began to regroup, pulling himself back into the rhythm that had carried him through decades of late-night dominance. He offered a faint smile, the kind that masked discomfort with practiced ease. "You talk about responsibility, Karoline," he said, voice steadier than before, "but let's not pretend you're walking into gunfire alone. You stand behind a podium in the White House, that's not exactly no man's land." Karoline let out a soft exhale, not a laugh but something closer to disbelief. "You think that podium protects me?" she replied. "Try standing there every day, unscripted, alone, answering to a press corps trained to tear you apart for who you are, not just what you say." Colbert gestured to the set around him. "And you think this is scripted safety? I've faced lawsuits, hate mail, threats on my life. I've called out war criminals on this very stage." His voice was rising, not in anger, but in self-defense. "I don't get a security detail. I walk out that door and face the world just like everyone else." Karoline leaned in, her voice calm but cutting. "Yes, but the world claps for you when you do it. You have a writer's room, a laugh track. You control the edit, you control the audience. I stand in a room where every mistake can go viral, every word twisted. I don't get applause, I get consequences." The crowd stirred. What began as a clash of ideology was now a stark contrast in experience. Performance versus pressure, scripted satire versus unscripted scars. Karoline continued, voice unwavering. "You built your platform in a world where people tuned in for laughs. I came of age in a world where one sentence can end your career in an hour. You crack jokes, I carry weight. You wear irony like armor, I wear my name like a target." Colbert looked down briefly, adjusting the stack of index cards in front of him, the irony not lost on anyone in the room. "So what? You're saying I don't take risks?" he asked. "That because I use humor I'm soft?" Karoline shook her head. "No. I'm saying we're from two different realities. You learned to challenge power from the outside, I have to survive it from within, and surviving doesn't leave room for punchlines." The generational divide had never been clearer. Colbert, a titan of media who had built his influence through satire, was facing a new kind of challenger, one forged not in comedy clubs or writers' rooms, but in the brutal, unfiltered glare of social media, press briefings, and public scrutiny. Karoline wasn't just defending her side of the aisle, she was redefining what resilience looked like for her generation, and in doing so she exposed something the audience hadn't seen in Colbert before, a trace of irrelevance, not because he wasn't still brilliant, but because the rules of the game had changed and for once, he wasn't the one writing them. As the silence stretched, both figures sat opposite one another. One, the polished architect of nightly satire, the other, the battle-hardened symbol of a new, unforgiving era. This wasn't just a debate, it was a passing of the cultural torch, and it was far from over. The moment arrived not with a raised voice, but with a calm so deliberate it sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Karoline Leavitt, still seated upright with perfect posture, let the last of Colbert's words fade into silence before speaking again, this time slower, almost quiet. "You want to talk about risk?" she said, locking eyes with him. "You want to talk about standing up for something?" She leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "Success isn't about who laughs the loudest, Julian. It's about who's still standing when the laughter stops, when the lights go down, when the cameras are off. It's about what you've built and who still stands beside you when no one's clapping." The words struck like a bell, clear, resonant, inescapable. The audience, which had been shifting and murmuring minutes before, now sat in absolute stillness. Even the soft hum of the stage lights seemed quieter. Julian Colbert blinked, lips slightly parted, as if he wanted to respond but found nothing suitable. He had weathered thousands of interviews, confronted senators, celebrities, activists, but this was different. This wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. Karoline didn't smirk, she didn't lean back triumphantly. She simply sat still, hands folded lightly in her lap as if her words didn't need her presence to echo. They would carry themselves. Behind the cameras, one of the producers muttered into a headset, "We've got a moment. Don't cut." The silence lingered, longer than anyone expected, and with every passing second it became clear to everyone this wasn't just the peak of the conversation, it was the shift in power. Colbert cleared his throat, tried to re-engage, but even his most loyal audience members could feel it. He had been hit with something no punchline could counter. Karoline's words weren't clever, they were true, and truth, spoken plainly, can silence the sharpest satire. In that moment she wasn't just defending a position, she was defining a generation. The applause didn't come immediately, it came slowly, like people unsure whether it was even appropriate to clap. But then it grew modest, then building, reverent, not explosive, not a celebration of a takedown, but a recognition. Something real had just happened. A line had been drawn, and Karoline Leavitt had drawn it, without ever raising her voice. Julian Colbert sat back, visibly shifted by the weight of Karoline's mic drop moment. The theater lights hadn't dimmed, but something in his expression had gone, was the glint of playful sarcasm that usually lived behind every retort. Instead, he looked contemplative, almost exposed. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a breath that sounded more like a surrender than a setup, he leaned forward and said softly, "You're good, Karoline, really good. I've had a lot of guests sit across from me over the years, but not many have made me pause." His voice lacked its usual rhythm, like he was speaking without a script for the first time in a long time. The audience, still reeling from the tension, listened with a different kind of energy, less entertainment, more reverence. Colbert glanced down at the cue cards in front of him, then slowly slid them aside. "You talked about the lights going out, about who's still standing after the applause fades. I've never heard it put quite like that," he said. "Maybe you're right, maybe I have taken some of this for granted, the crew, the writers, even the people on the other side of the jokes." There was no punchline, no wink to the camera, just honesty. For a host who'd built a career on exposing hypocrisy through satire, it was a rare moment of internal exposure. "I won't pretend to know Jake, or what he went through," Colbert added, "but I do know what it's like to carry something you said longer than the audience ever remembers it. Maybe I haven't always looked close enough at the fallout." Karoline didn't interrupt. She simply nodded, her silence granting him space to wrestle with the truth she had placed in front of him. Colbert looked up, the flicker of humility still in his eyes. "I believe in what I do," he said. "But maybe believing isn't enough. Maybe questioning others should start with questioning myself first." The audience began to shift again, this time not in discomfort but in understanding. Colbert hadn't retreated, he hadn't conceded defeat, but he had reflected. And in doing so, he turned the moment into something deeper. A conversation not just about responsibility, but about growth. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected twist of the night. Julian Colbert, still seated in a posture of reflection, slowly began to reclaim his footing, not as the satirical giant, but as a man unwilling to leave the conversation unfinished. With a more composed tone, he leaned forward and said, "You talk a lot about standing firm, Karoline, about responsibility, about truth. But let me ask you something that millions of people are thinking. Is your loyalty to the truth or to a man? Because let's be honest, your boss, the one you defend from that podium, he's not exactly known for putting others before himself." The question landed not like an attack, but as a challenge, a direct strike at the heart of Karoline's convictions. The audience murmured, sensing a final round was beginning. Karoline didn't flinch. In fact, she smiled, not smugly, but knowingly, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. "I've been asked that question more times than I can count," she replied, her voice calm but edged with fire. "Let me make it clear, I'm loyal to what I believe in. Not just to a man, but to a vision. A belief that this country can be strong, honest, and accountable again. You don't have to agree with that vision. You don't even have to respect my boss. But don't confuse loyalty with blindness." She let the words hang for a beat, then added, "You say I'm loyal to someone who's divisive. But I'd rather stand beside someone I believe in and take every bullet that comes with it than hide behind clever words and call it bravery." Colbert's face tensed, the line cutting deeper than he expected. The audience absorbed her words in silence, the room thick with unspoken judgment. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about principles versus performance, loyalty versus detachment. And in this final exchange, Karoline didn't just defend herself. She dismantled the idea that conviction could be easily dismissed as blind allegiance. She had taken Colbert's sharpest question and turned it into her strongest answer, one that left the host and the crowd with nothing left to say. The tension in the Skyline Theater had thinned, not from resolution, but from transformation. Karoline Leavitt and Julian Colbert now sat not as opponents locked in ideological combat, but as two voices from different Americas who had just endured something rare, a real conversation. Colbert, eyes still heavy with thought, looked across the stage at Karoline with something different in his expression. Not defiance, not irony, but respect. "You're formidable, Karoline," he said, his voice stripped of performance. "I've done this show for a long time, and very few people have ever made me stop, rethink, and sit in silence. You did that." A soft ripple of applause began, not the explosive kind that follows a viral joke, but the slow, sincere kind that honors a moment of truth. Karoline offered a nod, her voice equally measured. "I didn't come here to win, Julian," she said. "I came here because we need to start having harder conversations in places like this. Not rehearsed, not sanitized, just real." For the first time all night, Colbert smiled. Not the showman's grin, but something human, almost weary. He extended his hand. "Well, thank you for bringing real." She took it without hesitation, their handshake firm. Two ideological adversaries finding common ground, not in agreement, but in willingness to engage. The audience standing now didn't cheer for a victor. They applauded what the moment represented, that dialogue, when unfiltered and unafraid, can still crack through even the most fortified echo chambers. On stage, Karoline gathered her notes, nodded once to the crowd, and exited with the same poise she entered, leaving behind a host who, for once, had more questions than punchlines. Colbert turned back to the audience, his voice softer than usual. "Maybe we just did something special here tonight," he said, almost to himself. "And maybe that's what this place should be for." As the house lights dimmed and outro music played, the applause faded not into noise, but into thought. For one night, satire met sincerity, and neither walked away untouched. In a divided nation on a divided stage, a rare moment of mutual respect had emerged, not because they agreed, but because they dared to face each other without blinking. The clash between Karoline Leavitt and Julian Colbert didn't end when the lights dimmed at the Skyline Theater. It detonated across the internet like a cultural earthquake. Within minutes of the broadcast's conclusion, clips of their exchange flooded social media, with hashtags like Leavitt vs. Colbert and Mic Drop Moment and Skyline Showdown trending worldwide. Some called it a generational reckoning. Others labeled it a calculated ambush, but no matter which side you were on, one thing was clear: everyone was talking. On X, formerly Twitter, users were split down ideological lines. Karoline Leavitt just redefined what it means to hold the media accountable, one post read, garnering hundreds of thousands of likes. Another fired back, "Colbert gave her a platform, kept his cool, and still asked the hard questions. That's real journalism." Prominent journalists, politicians, and entertainers jumped into the fray, some praising Karoline's poise under fire, others defending Colbert's legacy as a satirical truth-teller. Mainstream media didn't stay silent either. Opinion pieces poured in from both liberal and conservative outlets. The New York Times published a headline, "When satire gets silenced, did Colbert get cornered?" Meanwhile, the Daily Wire led with, "Leavitt exposes comedy's cowardice." A new voice rises. Talk shows, morning news, and political podcasts dissected every moment of the exchange, the tone, the timing, even the silence. Analysts debated whether this marked a cultural shift in how younger conservatives engage with legacy media, or simply a one-night disruption of the usual formula. But beyond the pundits and partisans, something more visceral was happening. Viewers across generational lines shared personal reflections. A young woman posted on Instagram, "I've never seen anyone hold their ground like that. Karoline made me rethink how we treat politics in media." A retired teacher commented on Facebook, "I may not agree with her politics, but I haven't seen that kind of courage in a long time." Others latched onto Jake Ramirez's story as the emotional centerpiece, a stark reminder that behind every joke or viral clip, there are lives and reputations affected. Even in comedy circles, debates erupted. Was satire losing its teeth, or had it simply been confronted by someone it couldn't reduce to a caricature? Comedy writers and late-night peers weighed in, some defending Colbert, others admitting that maybe the genre needed to evolve. Through it all, Karoline Leavitt's calm defiance became a symbol not just of political conviction, but of generational disruption. She hadn't just walked onto Julian Colbert's stage, she had reframed it, and the world, still buzzing with reactions, wasn't quite sure how to go back to normal. As the dust settled from one of the most electric exchanges in recent television memory, a quieter, more reflective voice emerged. Karoline Leavitt's final message, not delivered from a podium or stage, but in a voiceover that played as the credits rolled and the theater lights dimmed. Her words weren't defiant or celebratory, they were resolute. "It's easy to chase applause," she said, "to live for the laugh, the likes, the viral clip, but at the end of the day, when the cameras shut off and the spotlight cools, who's still standing beside you? What's left of what you've built?" The footage rolled behind her voice. Slow shots of the Skyline Theater emptying out, Colbert sitting alone on stage, flipping through his cue cards without urgency, and viewers at home pausing in thought before switching off their TVs. Karoline's voice continued. "Success isn't the loudest moment of the night. It's the quiet aftermath, when people remember what you said long after they've forgotten how you said it. It's not about perfect words. It's about whether those words meant something, whether they moved someone, whether they left a mark that outlasts applause." Her words didn't accuse or divide, they reminded. Reminded the audience that beyond political theater and cultural satire, beyond party lines and media edits, there are people like Jake who carry the scars of careless storytelling, who work in silence without needing credit, and who show up, even when the world turns its back. Colbert, once the unquestioned architect of the stage, now sat humbled, not defeated, as Karoline's voice filled the space with the one thing no script could replicate: sincerity. "You don't measure strength by who wins the night," she concluded. "You measure it by who shows up the next morning, who keeps showing up, even when no one claps. That's what I believe in. That's who I stand with." The screen faded to black, not with a triumphant note or roaring cheer, but with a lingering silence that said more than any headline could. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, Karoline Leavitt had left a moment that wouldn't be so easily erased. She didn't just walk into Julian Colbert's world, she left a crack in its foundation. And when the laughter faded, she was still standing. The final question wasn't who won the night, but who had changed it. And perhaps, in that stillness, the audience found their answer. The story of Karoline Leavitt and Julian teaches us that true power doesn't always lie in the spotlight, but in the courage to confront it. Karoline didn't come to win applause or exchange witticisms. She came to challenge the comfortable rhythms of media performance and ask the harder questions about responsibility, empathy, and the human cost of public discourse. Her calm, conviction-free presence disrupted a stage built on satire and revealed how easily clever words can obscure real consequences. Through the story of Jake Ramirez, she reminded us that behind every viral joke might be someone's unraveling reputation, someone's silence. But just as powerful was Julian's quiet reflection, a veteran host forced for perhaps the first time in years to listen instead of respond. The lesson is simple but urgent. In a world obsessed with speed, performance, and clout, sincerity still matters. It takes strength to speak without armor, to stand your ground without shouting, and to admit when you've overlooked the weight of your own influence. The exchange didn't crown a winner, but it left everyone watching with the same lingering thought. What do we leave behind when the lights go out, and who's still standing with us when they do?